Good afternoon. I'm Gia Smith, the president of Franciscan's Political Science Association. On behalf of the association, I'm very excited to introduce our speaker today to speak on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Dr. Daniel Kempton. Dr. Kempton received his bachelor's degree from Notre Dame and his MA and PhD from the University of Illinois in political science. At Northern Illinois University, he served as the chairman of the Department of Political Science for 7 years. Dr. Kempton is Vice President of Academic Affairs here at Franciscan, as well as political science professor here. Dr. Kempton is widely published, including his books, Soviet Policy in South Africa, The National Liberation Movement Connection, and a co-edited volume of Unity or Separation, Center-Periphery Relations in the Former Soviet Union. Dr. Kempton has received numerous research grants and 12 fellowships, including twice the prestigious Fulbright Fellowship to Rhodes University in South Africa and to Tver University in Russia. In addition to his books, Dr. Kempton has also published articles, book chapters, case studies, and book reviews in journals such as Pew Case Studies in International Affairs, International Journal in Public Administration, and Russian Review, to just name a few. Without further ado, Political Science Association would like to welcome Dr. Kempton.
Thank you, Gia, and thanks for coming today. I wish it was a more pleasant topic to talk about, but it is certainly a poignant topic to be discussing today. I've designed my talk today around two basic questions that I think I am more qualified to address than some of the others you might have, but I'm hoping you'll come back with, I'm going to try and speak for about 30 to 40 minutes and then leave the last 15 to 20 if this works well. I haven't timed it, so I'm not sure it will, but leave the last 15 to 20 for questions about some of the other topics. I really am more of a Russian expert than I am a Ukrainian expert. I started going to Russia back when it was the former Soviet Union. I should actually say my undergraduate degree was in government and international studies, and Russia was my area studies specialization, and I studied the Russian language, which I do not speak well, but I do speak well enough to get around in Russia. As Gia mentioned, in 2008, I was a Fulbright scholar at Tver State University, which is Tver State University, which is just north of Moscow. But simultaneous to that, my daughter was actually a Peace Corps worker in Zaporizhia down in southern Ukraine. So I spent a fair bit of my weekend time going back and forth between Ukraine and Russia during that period. So I've been to most of the eastern parts of Ukraine, and although I haven't done a lot of research there. So I've chosen two questions which are really focusing on the Russian side and Americans' response to it and whether it's an effective response. The first question I wanted to speak about is assessing Putin's motive. What was he after? Why has he been going in? I think it's a lot more complex than you sometimes hear, and it certainly isn't a recreation of the Soviet Union, which is sort of one of the simplified assessments you sometimes get in the Western press. The second question I want to talk about is sort of assessing my take on the American response thus far. I mean, what did we do wrong in the past? What have we done right? What have we done wrong since this started to unravel? Let me start with Putin's motives and what it's about. I'm really going to be talking about sets of motives in three different areas. The first set of motives, I think, are a series or a set of cultural factors. That one of Putin's primary arguments of his entire presidency, his presidencies, I should say, since he was president and left the presidency, put his friend in charge of the presidency, and then conveniently came back when he had served a term out of the presidency. But one of the things he's always argued is that there was a great loss in the creation of the Soviet Union. He's always argued, he is reported to have said something to the effect that one of the greatest geostrategic tragedies of the 20th century was the collapse of the Soviet Union. That statement is sometimes taken to mean, well, he was a KGB colonel, he's still a KGB, he's still a believer in communism. I do not believe that is the case. I do believe he's a believer in Russian great power status. So this cultural argument, I think, is quite important to him. He traces back that great power status to an early state called Kievan Rus. which was founded in the late 800s. It was a Varangian state, meaning it was founded by the voyagers or the Varangians from the peoples of Norway and Sweden, basically the Vikings as we'd say it today. The center of that state was really in Kiev, which was the capital of it. So it's often called Kievan Rus, Rus referring to the people, Kiev referring to the seat of it. What's interesting about this map is this is a little bit later. I think this map is about 1011. It shows the principal princedoms of Kievan Rus. You will note one admission. I wrote Kiev and не Moskva, not Moscow. Moscow doesn't even exist in the Kievan state, but Putin wants to claim that he is the successor state to Kiev, and that's very important to him. The Kiev actually is the center of this great culture. By the way, it's the largest and one of the more popular states throughout the 10th and 11th century. So it really is a great center of early European culture, power, military might, linguistics, lots of different ways, and that's why both countries are trying to trace their way back to Kievan Rus. One of the more important parts of Kievan Rus is this gentleman here. It's kind of funny because I think most of you know the president of Ukraine is Vladimir Zelensky, and the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. It's the same name, basically, and both of them find their way back. One is Ukrainian, one is the Russian pronunciation. But the most famous Vladimir is this, Vladimir, who was in some ways the founder, although it already existed, of the Kievan Rus. He is the one who made it great and in many ways very important. He is the one who Christifies it. He converts to Christianity. According to the stories, he sent out emissaries to all the different religions, heard from Islam, didn't like Islam. One of the problems with Islam is you couldn't drink or eat pork. I agree with him on this point. Christianity, however, you could drink, you could eat pork, you could also marry the princess of Constantinople, the great Byzantine Empire, and he did so, and that created the Christianization of the Slavic world in particular, and he was the leader of that. This is critical because I argued that Putin is not a communist recreated, he is a great power Russian nationalist, and he sees the heritage of Russia tying back to Kievan Rus, and Russia being what is sometimes called the Third Rome. What he means by that is Rome was the original Rome, of course, but when Rome got corrupt and began to fall, Byzantium became the center of Christianity. When Kievan Rus falls, he argues that Moscow and the Patriarchy of Moscow becomes the center. In modern times, this will become very controversial once again, partially because Orthodoxy has a tradition of what is called autocephalous, self-headed churches, and what that literally means is usually the church goes with the state, and there is a different Orthodox church and a different independent bishop in each of the major countries of Orthodoxy. Up until 1917, basically there was one Orthodox church. 1917, a first one breaks away. Well, there's actually an earlier one tied to Rome, but a second one breaks away, claiming Ukrainian independence. It happened again more recently in that the Orthodox Church in 2018 in Ukraine, the most significant one, declared requested its independence from the Russian Orthodox Church. In Putin's world, this was a big deal because it undermines the claim to the legitimacy to all of this cultural heritage. The Tsarist state also saw this as a point of continuity between Kievan Rus and the Russian state. Peter the Great helped take part of Ukraine back from what was at the time the Ottomans. Catherine the Great also takes part back. She takes back what was called the Crimean Khanate, and she actually refers to the people that she sees back as Novorossiyski, New Russians, and tries to make the argument that this is essentially the same people. So this question of Ukrainian identity, which we hear being played out with Putin's claims and the Ukrainian denials, is not a new question. This is an old question. Ukraine existed as a state intermittently from about the 1200s on. At some times it's under the control of Poland, at the time under the control of the Teutonic Knights, at other times under Lithuanian, and other times under Russian control. So different parts of Ukraine are under different controls at different points in history. What really happens, if I can go back a bit, prior to the Mongol invasion, Kiev is clearly the cultural, the political, the military center of this area. But Kiev was one of the last areas to break away from the Mongols. Moscow actually receives its centrality when it begins breaking away from the Mongol invaders. It's one of the earlier and one of the central ones. In fact, Moscow and Tver were the two princedoms that broke away first. The symbol of Tver, where I used to work, was an empty throne, meaning the throne should have been there, but Moscow stole it, as far as they were concerned. So Moscow then emerges after the after the Mongols as the center of the empire, as the center of Slavic, particularly Russian culture. I think that's very much part of the issue. The other part of the issue is that if you can look down here, we're not going to get a very good thing of it, but there's a long Russian-Ukrainian border. Over the centuries, this border's moved back and forth. And in fact, Crimea down here, you'll often read in the news, was given back to Ukraine, but to the Ukrainian Socialist Republic by Nikita Khrushchev, who was actually born in Ukraine, as part of a gift celebrating an anniversary. So the border has been very fluid. What that means is when you look at the eastern half of Ukraine, it tends to be more Russian-speaking and more ethnic Russian. And it's important you make a distinction because those are not the same. There are Ukrainians who are primarily Russian speakers. There are ethnic Russians who are primarily Ukrainian speaking, depending on where in the country they live, what school system they went to, etc. But again, there's this whole cultural argument that's very important to President Putin to say Russia ought to be a great power because they've always been a great power. They've been this long-term source of stability and history. The second, I think, critical factor for Russia in wanting control of Ukraine is geostrategic policy. I think many of you know the traditional argument. If you look at Russia, either the Russian Federated Republic as it existed, or even the whole Soviet Union, one of the things you note is most of the water border is in the north. Russia didn't have warm water ports. The one traditional, sometimes exception, was Sevastopol and the Crimean Peninsula. So that was always very important to them. I think that can be overemphasized. A second argument I would make, and in some ways more important in Russian history and Russian understanding of the world, let me start by saying something about America. We have a very strange view of history in America because our history is very strange. Yes. If you look at American history, think of all those times America has been invaded and all the major threats to America. Okay, 1812, well, sort of, maybe a big deal. They burned the Capitol. That was really mean, nasty. But, you know, not massive invasions. Our borders are the Atlantic and the Pacific on the east and west. Then we're faced with our great rivals, Canada and Mexico. So we tend to have a very unusual view of war, of threat, of history. Conversely, if you think about the Russian view of history, it's a history of invasion. Some of those other peoples, countries that have invaded are the Mongols, the Teutonic Knights, the Ottoman Empire, the Polish Empire, the Kingdom of Lithuania, the Swedish Kingdom, France, America, Britain, Germany twice, Japan once, I mean, it's a long, long history of evasions of other countries putting troops into Russia. One of the problems is Russian geography. There's a long-time argument that your foreign policy is often affected by your geography. Russia has some fairly high mountain ranges, but they're all along the eastern coast. From Moscow and certainly from Kiev to the west is a large European plain. The Ural Mountains, most of the Russian population lives west of the Ural Mountains, and the invading alley goes all the way to Berlin, essentially. So Russia's been the subject of frequent invasions. Russia's always had a problem of how do I be secure? One modern historian essentially said the Russian response has been the Lombardy Doctrine. No, they didn't know the Green Bay coach, but they adopted a very similar policy. If you've studied the Green Bay Packers, their philosophy was ours, the best defense is a good offense. And what the Russians have historically done is make sure they can control some of the areas around them. If they've got no natural borders, you've got to control your neighbors. And that's what Russian history is, a long attempt to try and control some of the neighbors. Russians themselves refer to, so in here is the Russian Republic. When the Soviet Union fell apart, essentially the Soviet republics, the ones that say SSR, became separate countries. There wasn't a whole lot of logic to it. That was just the way the Soviet Union was designed. Borders had shifted back and forth. But when Putin talks, one of the arguments he's trying to make is that these borders don't make any sense, that they were a fiction created by some of the Soviet leaders. In many ways, he's right about that. Russians, when they categorize their foreign policy, talk about blizhnye zarubezhye, which refers to the near abroad. The near abroad, some people in America talk about a sphere of influence. Well, in some ways that works. There are times in American history where we say, stay out of our hemisphere, that the European powers should not be involved in here. But this is much more permanent, and it's much more distinctive in saying, these countries that are part of the near abroad, they're not really separate. They're not really entire autonomous. By virtue of their history, by virtue of their geography, Russia has a special role to play in all of these countries. So when Putin's making these arguments, he's not treating Ukraine or even Latvia, Lithuania, or Estonia like any other country. He's saying these are in some ways, by definition of geography, by definition of history, culture, our area. So it's like spheres of influence. It's like the Monroe Doctrine, but it's much more rooted in history. It's much more affirmed. It's much more a part of the Russian psyche. The third argument I would make is economic. And sometimes we started talking about this at the beginning of the war. It's disappeared very quickly. But if you look at Ukraine, has always been very important to the Russian Tsarist economy, to the Soviet economy. This map doesn't show it, but one of the main waterways, the Dnieper River, comes down just to the west of the Crimean Peninsula. That was a major trade track for the Russian-Soviet economy. It was also important because of the natural resources. Eastern Ukraine is northern is a big coal manufacturing, sort of the western Pennsylvania, West Virginia, eastern Ohio part of the former Soviet Union. Ukraine is also the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, which makes it all the more ironic that Stalin once starved them out and took away their grain during the Holodomor. So this is very critical to the Russian economy. In the last 20 years, it's become even more critical. Why? Because Russia is now making a huge percentage of its foreign earnings through the sale of natural gas and oil. Basically, Germany heats itself with Russian gas. Pretty much most of the states around it do as well. Germany gave up on nuclear power. Germany gave up on coal, which it used to buy from Poland. So many of the states in Western Europe are totally dependent on Russian oil and gas. That also means the Russian economy is almost entirely dependent on selling these products. One of the main, couple of the main routes for Russian gas, this is one of the old routes. There was another one that went north directly through Ukraine. Russia was always upset that Ukraine said, hey, you're shipping your oil and gas across our country. You're maintaining pipelines in our country. You should give us a cut of this. And by the way, we shouldn't pay the same amount that Germany pays for your oil and gas. So there were times where the Ukrainians literally held the Russians hostage and said, lower the price, we won't pay the higher price. If you want the rest of your gas to go to Germany, you'll sell it to us at a lower price. Russia didn't like that. So part of this is Russia knows it needs this natural gas, needs to sell it to the West. Some studies say up to 35–40% of the Russian GDP or the Russian budget is created by oil and gas sales. So essentially, cut our budget by a third. Imagine what that does to the American economy. If Russia can't sell oil and gas, that's a large percent of its annual national budget. A second thing I want you to note on this map is the Black Sea, we believe, is one of the world's next great oil and gas reserves. The Caspian on the other side is already being developed. Already, this is where this gas route is. Russia recently formed a new route to go through. TUR means Turkey. So it's going through the Black Sea, but not through Ukrainian waters anymore. This is the Ukrainian exclusive zone, the Romanian, and the Russian zone here on the far right. But what we're also learning is that where are the big oil and gas finds? Well, look at that. They're all along the Ukrainian coast. So these oil and gas fields are either A, huge competition for Russian foreign sales, or B, the excess product for Russian sales to increase their economy. So again, I don't think these are entirely separate motives, but the last thing Russia wants is Ukraine developing all of these oil and gas fields that are technically in Ukrainian waters. And at the end of this, we'll look at a battle map of where we are, and it corresponds very closely to where the oil and gas fields. Russia is pushing very hard, not only for Kyiv, but also for the southern route along the Russian-speaking zone, so you can almost tie their battle plans to what I think Putin is trying to achieve. So for a variety of reasons, geostrategic, cultural, and economic, Russia has always felt that it needs to control. President Putin has argued from his very beginning as president that part of their greatness is controlling, that the way to Russia's great power status, which I think is his driving force, is to make sure he controls some of the near abroad and particularly Ukraine. Let me switch a little bit over to the Ukraine. Let me start by looking at American foreign policy in a couple of different ways. I'm shifted to that second question now. How do I assess the American response to this? Well, first of all, some people think Russia has just recently gotten involved, and others say, no, 2014 they took Crimea. 2014 they did this. In 2004, this man was the main Ukrainian candidate for the presidency of Ukraine. This cup has his name on it, Yushchenko. This is from what's called the Orange Revolution. He was running for president, and suddenly he broke out with this horrible, horrible disease, which they later found out was dioxin poisoning. Surprise, surprise. He's recovered significantly from that, but his face will never be the same. He never died from that. As Dr. Doyle was saying before the lecture started, the Russians really love their poisons, don't they? Yes, they do. I just learned today, I'm a big Chelsea soccer fan. The owner of the Chelsea soccer team is a former Russian oligarch, former Russian governor. They just found out today during his time in Kyiv trying to help facilitate negotiations, he was poisoned. Shocking. I wonder who did that. I think we'll pretty soon find out that it was the Russians once again. So let's talk about what are American goals. Let me switch slides for just a second. What does America want in our dealings with Putin? How well have we done? Let me start out with a statement by Biden. President Biden considers himself a progressive president. I would like to compare him to America's first progressive president, who I think had some very interesting foreign policy advice. Theodore Roosevelt actually ran a party called the Progressive Party, did a lot of progressive things politically, but had a foreign policy which alternately he said walk softly and carry a big stick. Sometimes he said talk softly and carry a big stick. Both of them, by the way, are not original to him. They're both based on an African proverb of how one behaves successfully in life. But this was really Roosevelt's foreign policy, which was a quite expansionistic but also successful foreign policy of pushing American power. What did it mean? What Roosevelt was really talking about was, look, to be effective in the foreign policy realm, you've got to act tough, you've got to prepare to be strong. In particular, Roosevelt wanted the Navy rebuilt. He wanted the Navy made more powerful so American power would be projected. But he argued that you shouldn't push your enemy too overtly. You shouldn't talk about it too loudly because that was counterproductive. In other words, be tough and be ready to defend yourself. Be ready to take action. Let your military power speak for itself. To the extent that I think there is a doctrine emerging related to that from the Biden foreign policy, apologize, I've used this with my students, the Biden foreign policy seems to be talk loudly and carry a Nerf gun. A lot of what we have going on is we should have been preparing for the last decade Ukraine for this day. This is not a surprise. This is not just President Biden's failure, although I will argue specifically there are some serious failures here. Successive American presidents have botched this one. Because of the way Putin has talked, we should have known from the very beginning that this was part of Putin's motivation. Again, when you say things like the collapse of the Soviet Union was one of the biggest geostrategic tragedies of the 20th century, same century as World War I, same century as the Holocaust, it kind of sends the signal, I think the Soviet collapse was a bad thing, not technically reversing it, but trying to recreate that great power status. So from the beginning, we knew this might be a problem. In 2008, in fact, Ukraine reached a point where they were trying to join NATO. They had, in April of 2008, they filled out the paperwork to become NATO members and were actually accepted into this Map for Progress plan where they would propose their way to NATO membership. They would have to do some things to reach NATO membership, which they hoped would happen within a year or two. So this is April of 2008. December 2008, however, there is a new president elected in the United States, or actually November 2008. We have the election of President Obama with his Vice President Biden. They are not so interested in bringing Ukraine into NATO, partially because Putin makes it clear he sees this as provocative. George W. Bush was very friendly with Putin, but actually was moving Ukraine onto the track for NATO membership. In 2010, they actually ousted Yushchenko. He gets replaced by a man by the name of Viktor Yanukovych, who is actually a Russian ally, wins the election some shenanigans occurred in the election. We're still not sure who run a couple of the Ukrainian elections, but Yanukovych essentially takes them off track, and the opportunity has been missed by 2010 on both sides. They're no longer pushing so hard for NATO membership. We're no longer so interested in NATO membership for the Ukraine. So one should say, well, it's a shame we missed an opportunity, that we could have made a commitment to Ukraine that might have deterred Putin, that might have prevented him from acting. Very clearly, we don't want to respond to Putin. We don't want to get involved in the war. With this, I fully agree with President Biden. We don't want to be involved in a boots-on-the-ground war in Ukraine. Our goal should have been, and we failed in it, to deter a Russian intervention. We should have deterred it. But I would argue that, in fact, we didn't just miss one opportunity, we missed multiple opportunities. Let me take you back a little bit further. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there were actually 4 successor states that had nuclear weapons: Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan. All 4 of them have nuclear weapons. Technically, at that point in history, Ukraine is the world's 3rd biggest nuclear power in terms of number of warheads. We believed this was a bad thing for the world. We thought they really shouldn't have nuclear warheads. Having 3 more members of the nuclear club isn't a good thing. We pushed for an agreement. We pushed for Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan to get rid of their nuclear weapons. We eventually reached an agreement called the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances that was signed in December of 1994. What that said was that the other successor states would give up their nuclear weapons. We would demilitarize their nuclear weapons. The Russians would help take back their nuclear material. They would reprocess the material from those warheads, and they would join the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They would become official, committed members of the Nuclear Proliferation Agreement. But it wasn't just Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus that were working on this agreement. The US, the United Kingdom were also parties to the agreement. Now, if you read the agreement, again, signed in December of 1994, it says they guarantee that they will release their nuclear weapons, turn them over, will not continue nuclear power research or nuclear weapons research, and will turn all over their weapons. The US, the United Kingdom, and Russia, as guarantors of that treaty, promise that they will serve as guarantors of the territorial integrity of the states surrendering their nuclear weapons. So we literally are saying, we are guarantors of your sovereignty. Russia it's been pointed out recently, is violating this agreement by invading. Well, in some ways, we're violating the agreement by not serving as our full guarantor function. Again, I don't think it's prudent to do so. But as you can see, we missed some opportunities along the way. The final opportunity I think we missed was the biggest thing. I know President Trump and Putin looked like friends. They got along. They talked on the phone. They seemed friendly. Trump still says some nice things about Putin's at times, but Trump did the worst thing to Putin he could possibly do. What did he do? He took the limits off the American oil and gas industry. He took the limits off the American oil and gas industry. What did that do to Russia? 58% of my foreign income is coming from oil and gas. Suddenly, one of the largest consumers of oil and gas within 4 years drops from major consumer to somewhat of an exporter. That changes the world oil market. I loved it. I was paying $1.89 a tank, or a gallon to fill my tank. You all probably appreciated it as well, but for Russia, that was a horrible thing. Now, where are we? Well, one of the first things President Putin or President Biden did for Mr. Putin was to take off the sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. This is a pipeline that Russia built for its natural gas to flow from Russia to Germany without going through Ukraine. So you're limiting Ukrainian power if you allow this to take place. Trump sanctioned it. He thought it wasn't a good idea. It was going to make Germany totally dependent. He was right about that. What he didn't talk a lot about, but was also absolutely critical, is Ukraine had some control over Russian behavior when the Nord Stream isn't in effect. I hope the Nord Stream 2 never came. This is 2. This is the second one of these. I hope it never opens. But if we back away, if President Putin says, okay, we'll negotiate, that's going to be one of his first requests. We want the Nord Stream 2 sanctions off, this to open oil and gas to flow to Germany. So in my opinion, this was something we should have been trying to deter. I don't think we've handled it particularly well since it's broken out. I will say that President Biden's personality has been easier for our European allies to work with. In many ways, it's a foreign policy strategy I saw with President Obama, which some critically called leading from behind, but meaning we're letting Germany take the lead. I mean, Germany looks tougher in all of this. Poland looks voracious in all of this. And we look weak-willed in all of this. I should have pointed out another thing we did that made all of this possible was when we pulled out of Afghanistan without a permanent guarantee of Afghan territorial integrity, we were essentially saying, look, we're not into protecting our commitments abroad. I realize that's a step Trump wanted to make and couldn't make. He didn't make it, but he was talking about it too. But once you start backing away from global commitments, you're sending a signal to this guy here who has for a decade and a half wanted to take over Ukraine, saying, hey, you've got a unique opportunity. The economic pressures are off. America looks like it's going to be weaker. And it doesn't look like there's a firm American commitment to the Ukraine at this time. I was very pessimistic when this all started. Ukraine has been amazing. Zelensky, I mean, Churchillian is the word often used. I buy it. I mean, I have not seen a leader turn such a negative position into a positive one in recent decades. I know there's things about Putin that are good. There's things about Zelensky you don't like, but people are complex characters. Zelensky. People are complex characters. I would not confuse the man who says, I oppose LGBT rights with the one who's killed 23 documented journalists and probably over 150. I mean, there's some horrible things going on, even though there might be some things you like in his policies. And I think the world is not going to be safer with a more powerful, more aggressive Russia, which could easily lead to a more powerful and more aggressive China as well. And I'm going to actually stop there. I promised 20 minutes for comments and questions, so let's move to that. Oh, I wanted to do one more thing before I do that. Remember I mentioned those oil and gas fields? If you overlay the map, this is where, across here is where most of them are. When I mentioned the Russian speakers, this is where most of them are. I mentioned the port facilities. Suddenly this becomes a Russian lake and rather than an international sea. So if you look at the strategy, I think the original Putin strategy was twofold. One was to take parts of Russia. This is not a new game. It's happened in Moldova. Transdniester is now effectively part of Russia. It's closer to Russia than to the rest of Moldova. It's happened in Georgia with South Ossetia. It's happened across the near abroad. They took before Crimea. I think they had in their sights Donetsk and Luhansk, and maybe the one major Ukrainian city that has fallen is Kherson. Why does that matter? Again, major transportation route, major oil and gas finds. I don't think that's coincidental. I think the rest of Ukraine, he may be willing. Today we heard about the two-state solution. think that's been something Putin's had in mind as a backup policy. I think he wanted it all. I think he wanted a guy like Yanukovych in charge. But I think he would be satisfied if he can get a demilitarized, he would call it denazified Ukraine, but a puppet state in the rest of the Ukraine, and cede some of the Ukrainian key territory, maybe the coal fields, maybe the gas and oil fields, maybe the Russian speakers become part of Russia. And certainly, by the way, my daughter was terrified. Right here is a city called Zaporizhia. But the nuclear power plant that serves the entire Crimean Peninsula is up there. And that's why I think they went for that. I told her I don't think they want ZAP. I think they want just to control the power plant. They now control both the water aqueducts going to Crimea and the power lines going to Crimea, which makes it a much more stable part. I wish I could be optimistic. I'm joining Father in my prayers. My daughter has lots of Ukrainian friends. I have a few. I have lots of Russian friends. Keep in mind that if we're going to bring down Putin, it's going to be done domestically. One more comment. I'm sorry. Walk softly, but carry a big stick. That means calling your enemy a, quote, a peer thug, a killer, a butcher, a brute and a bully, a murderous dictator, a war criminal, and saying this man cannot remain in power essentially closes the off-ramp. We need, unless we're going to have some way of taking Putin out, which I don't believe we do, he doesn't even sit within 20 feet of anyone else anymore. If we're going to try and take him down, that's one thing, but we really need to negotiate an out for him. And to me, I think all of us should be calling him names. All of us should be hating him. But it's not really a good thing for the president to do, because the president, like presidents before him, may somehow have to deal with a Putin in the future. And to negotiate with him, you shouldn't really be calling him names, especially names. They're true, but still don't do it, is what I'd say. Thanks, Bob. I think we better end. I think we're a quarter after your ending time, but thank you very much.
Absolutely. I would like to give a few thanks before we end. First, I'd like to thank all of the executive committee members of the Political Science Association. They've done like all of the behind-the-scenes stuff. So yes, I would like to thank them a lot. I'd like to thank Mrs. Orr for helping the association so much putting this together. I'd like to thank the Political Science Department, including Dr. Crayson, who's helped us with like all the refreshments, getting that here, and funding for it. And of course, I'd like to thank Dr. Kempton, so let's give him another round of applause.
And let's thank Gia for her help too. Thank you.